Hello, welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom. And in this video, we're going to be looking at a YouTube video about the WASPs. So if you aren't familiar with this channel, I believe I already covered at least one book on this topic. So the WASPs were the Women Air Force Auxiliary Pilots during World War II. So this is a YouTube video, very well done. What's it called? Flying Dreams, Women Air Force Pilots of World War II. So this is free. It's a very well done video. What it talks about, and it's similar to the book that I already covered, but it talks about the history of these women pilots. And not only what they did in their experiences, they're interviewing at least, I think, 4 or 5 of these women, and how it came to be and what happened to them specifically, and that's kind of heartbreaking. So during World War II, obviously a lot of the pilots were going overseas, and so what normally would happen in non-war time is you would have men who were pilots, and they were test pilots, and they would build planes and they would fly the planes to separate bases. Well, with all they needed all these pilots overseas fighting, they eventually realized they didn't have enough men. So these women who had been watching the war effort, a lot of them had their pilot's license, they wanted to help, and 2 of them put forth to the head of the military, I believe General Arnold, who was in charge of the Army Air Corps at the time. The Air Force didn't exist yet. It wasn't a thing. So that's what these women could do. They could do the test pilots. They could do the ferrying of all these planes that they were cranking out. A lot of times women were the ones who were building the darn things. And they could ferry them to the bases where they could be trained on, and they could be sent overseas. So they created this program where they at first had just these women had to be licensed pilots, and they had outrageous qualifications they had to meet, as opposed to men who had nothing. Just to fly over to go to war, they didn't need flying experience at all, or a pilot's license. These women needed a civilian pilot's license, and so on, in a number of hours. Slowly that came down because they needed more women, they needed more help, and these women trained, and of course they were under stricter conditions, similar to the Tuskegee Airmen, who again were experimental. So were these women, and they were held to a stricter protocol than the white men. So it was easy for them to wash out, not because they weren't great pilots, but because white men didn't want them there. They didn't like them because of, in this case, they were women. Similar to Tuskegee Airmen, it's because they were black. So it was in some ways, almost a similar experience. It was very, very easy to wash out when these guys were training. Difference, of course, was the Tuskegee Airmen had a harder time when they got back, and they dealt with racism, but they were nobody denied the fact that they were part of the military. That's what happened with these women. They spent 2 years flying every single plane the U.S. military had. They lost, I think, 38 women in the line of work. They flew through planes that were broken down. They had 2 women who flew the type of bomber that dropped the atomic bombs, because most of the men were terrified to fly the darn things. So they decided, let's do an experiment. Let's train these 2 women to fly these things, to basically get the men to man up. It's like, if these women can do it, so can you. Yeah, and that's what they did. And the moment the men started feeling threatened by these women, they were off. And that's essentially what ended up happening. The war, not necessarily, kind of started winding down, particularly on the Eastern Front, where they had decimated the Air Force of both the Japanese and the Nazis. So these male pilots were coming back, and they were pissed off because these women had their jobs. There was also men who, when they didn't need as many test pilots, they were being able to be sent to war, and they were pissed off. Because how dare they? How dare these women be taking our jobs? How dare these uppity women who should be in the kitchen and not taking our work? And they launched a smear campaign that the women couldn't counteract. They were told to be quiet by their superiors, as Arnold himself fought Congress to make them officially part of the military. Now remember, these women marched, they trained, they lived on bases, they pretty much were treated as military. And they weren't included, so they didn't get benefits. When these 38 women died, they got nothing. They were treated like civilians. Even though they were technically military, they got no honors. Now, I believe I covered, hopefully this month, I'll cover another book on an Asian pilot who was one of those women who died. And they had to fight to get her buried, her and her brother as well, buried in a cemetery. Any cemetery, not a military cemetery, but any cemetery. When these 38 women got no honors. And when these basically, right, I believe it was the end of 44 when they were kicked out. They were unceremoniously just kicked out. Basically, we're ending the program. Congress has decided it's a waste of time. They've been convinced by this smear campaign that it's a waste of time, that these women are useless and they shouldn't be doing this. So basically they were told, you're done. And the majority of them could never fly again. They were heartbroken. I mean, they had this video showed these women being interviewed, and it's like where they knew they were never going to fly again. They looked for civilian piloting jobs, but there weren't any. Nobody, even with all their flight experience, they couldn't get anything because nobody wanted them because they were women. And so they were quiet. And it essentially, these women essentially, and their contribution to the war effort disappeared, as opposed to all other women who were part of the nurses, the women who were working behind the lines, everybody else. These women who did death-defying jobs, they were flying broken down planes. They flew planes right off the assembly lines from place to place to place. They drop off one, pick up another. They were flying targets for inexperienced 18-year-old men to shoot at. Think about that. The type of guts it could take for these young women to fly an airplane, knowing that down below you, when they're supposed to be hitting a target, is an 18-year-old farm boy. Yeah, that takes guts. I mean, it takes a lot of guts. The other thing that they did was, and I mentioned this in the book review that I did on the same topic, of they would fly in precursors to drones. These planes were just big enough for them to squeeze into, and they were expensive, so they didn't want these young men to screw it up. So if they had to sit in there, without being able to touch controls until the very last second in case something went wrong. That again takes a heck of a lot of guts, and obviously the men weren't doing it. And the men probably didn't have enough guts to do it. So, and then after 2 years of all this work, flying all these planes, it just disappeared, and they were dispersed and forgotten. What ended up happening, and these women talk about this, is the 70s came around. Originally, they were just kind of some reaching out. They were friends. They would get together. But the Air Force starts announcing, and it's up in the paper, the first women Airforce pilots to fly military planes. Imagine how you would feel about that if you had spent 2 years of your life, hundreds of hours, risking your life for your country, to be forgotten. Completely. To be forgotten. And that's when these women started getting mad. As they have every right to be. They started getting mad. It's like, no. We were flying military planes back in the 40s. Sorry, but you're not the first women to be flying airplanes. So that's when they started gathering in larger numbers and thinking about petitioning for veterans' rights. They wanted veterans' rights. They deserved veterans' rights. They were veterans. Remember, these women would have been injured and they crashed, and they didn't get the military rights. They didn't get the GI Bill. In fact, one of them specifically says, like, because they were eventually given by the Obama administration the Congressional Medal of Honor. And she's like, people ask me, it's like, what would I rather have, the Congressional Medal of Honor or the GI Bill? I like the GI Bill. That's money to go to school, she said. Basically, it's like, my life would have been very, very different. So these women started fighting. They started fighting and petitioning, and General Arnold's son, who'd also been in the military and was now a lobbyist, showed up, and he said, I'm going to help you. Because this is what his father wanted. It's like, this is my father's dream, to have you recognized as what you are. And then oddly enough, the other person who was helping, which surprises me considering how ultra conservative he was Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was a very, very conservative senator from Arizona. And this was a man, I think he was known for, when he ran for president, during Vietnam, tried to scare the people like crazy using, I think, an atomic bomb simulation. So that's what Barry Goldwater was known for. It was very surprising for me to see that he was one of the champions of this. And it's because he'd flown with these women. He knew they were military. And they fought. And they fought. And they finally, I believe it was 77, they finally got veterans' rights. And what they had to do was somebody found their discharge paperwork that had U.S. Air Force on it. And they were sharing it to some of these, remember this is the 70s, so the vast majority of the senators and congressmen, particularly the men, had been military. They had fought in World War II. So when they're seeing this official discharge paperwork with the official sign of this is from the United States Air Force, they're like, oh, well, you are veterans. So, okay. And they got veterans' rights. And they had to continue to fight. They continue, besides getting veterans' rights, I know from not just this video, but the book that I read, that I reviewed on this channel, to get the right to be buried with military honors. And then finally, in I believe it was 2010, they were granted the Congressional Medal of Honor. And then eventually, by now, I don't remember exactly when, relatively recently, the United States Air Force finally recognizes that they exist. Seriously. It took until the 2020s to recognize these women who fought, who died, who sacrificed their lives for their bloody country. Yes, it was 2 years, but they did jobs the men did not want. And they finally got recognition that, you exist. Yes. So, but again, as one of them who seemed kind of bitter, and you would be, it was like, I would have taken this would have been benefited me back then. If we had been able to go into the military and gotten benefits. Apparently some of the women who then later joined the military realized that their 2 years as WASP weren't counting against their retirement. And that also pissed them off. I mean, it would. It's like, sorry, but we were working for you for 2 years, besides what we've already done. So it was a very interesting video, similar to the book. It talks about the same stories. It talks about the women. Only now you're hearing the story directly from, I believe, about 4 or 5 of these women, and how they're happy, but some of them are like, it's all we wanted was recognition. But again, it took us a long time and a lot of fighting and a lot of lobbying and a lot of hard work just to get recognized for work that we did. They had proof. They had written documents. They had photographs of them in military gear marching. The U.S. the military would have had records of this existing, and they ignored it for so long. And these women who are now in their 90s, I mean, they were young women in their 20s, finally being recognized. But it is an amazing video. Let's see how, I don't think, it's about an hour long. It's free on YouTube. It's done very, very well. I highly recommend it, particularly if you're talking about military history or women's history or World War II history, because that's what these women were doing, or flight history, the history of women in the air, the history of air flight. this is an important story to be told in a very educational video. Age range, probably just for comprehension of really being able to understand it. No, probably 5th grade, maybe 4th grade. I'm trying to think. My niece is about that age. She's just about 10 as of the shooting of this video. She'd probably be able to get this. So about 10 years old, maybe 9 at the youngest, would really be able to get this. And this goes on up through high school for this. It's just not a matter of, is it appropriate? It's a matter of, will they get it? Will they really understand what this history is? And I'm not sure younger kids would get it. But again, that depends on your child. So parents, you know your kid. And it's gonna vary. That's the reason we homeschool, is because we know our kids and we know when they're prepared for something. So it's a very great video. It's a free resource. Always a benefit of those free resources. So again, this is one of the title. I'll give the title again. It's Flying Dreams, Women Airforce Pilots of World War II. And yes, I will link it in the box below. So you'll have the description so you can access this. So that is it for this review. If you like what you see, be sure to like and subscribe. I do a lot of videos. Sometimes they're documentaries. I do books. I did a book specifically on this, a children's chapter book. What is the title of this? If you want to go back and look at it. Here it is. Fly Girls, the Daring. No, that's another video. Sorry. No, this is the book. There it is. Yes, it's Fly Girls, the Daring American Women Pilots who helped win World War II. So that's the book. That will be coming out next week, it looks like. That's already been filmed and edited. So I do not do these things in order. But be sure to check out the rest of the channel. I do, this is being filmed in January of 2022. You guys will be seeing this in November. I'm doing a lot of women in flight stuff in November. So be sure to check that out. I do a variety of other stuff, so be sure to check out the rest of the video. Fiction, nonfiction, fun stuff, younger kid stuff, older kid stuff, travel stuff, hopefully more travel stuff, and various educational materials. So be sure to check it out. So that is it. If you have a positive comment, please leave it. Otherwise, thank you.